Hello, I'm Jeff Brown, and welcome to the wide world of cinema. Tonight I saw a film called Luv Di Saun, an Urdu-language romance film that on the surface is about a man falling in love with a woman, but underneath that romance is something much darker. The woman at the center of the story was kidnapped as a young teenager and forced into prostitution. She grows up inside that world, not temporarily, not as some side subplot. That is the world she knows. That is her life. And what stayed with me after the movie wasn't simply the tragedy of her situation, it was how normal everything around her felt. That's the terrifying part. Not some cartoon villain standing in a dark alley, not evil announcing itself with dramatic music. Just ordinary life continuing around something horrific. People eating, laughing, working, falling in love, living their lives, while underneath all of it exists this machinery of exploitation quietly functioning like it's just another part of society. And there's a moment in the film that really struck me. The man who falls in love with her begins morally judging her for the life she lives. Well, he's angry, disgusted, conflicted. He cannot separate the woman he cares about from the world she exists inside. But one of his Sikh friends stops him. And what follows is probably the most important conversation in the entire film. Because the Sikh basically turns the entire moral lens of the story around. He says, and I'm paraphrasing, why are you blaming her? Why aren't you blaming the men? The married men who go there while their wives are at home, fathers who have daughters of their own and still participate in this world of sex and exploitation, the men who normalize it, the customers who keep it alive, the people with money and status who quietly participate while pretending moral superiority in public, the police officers who know these places exist, the politicians who know these systems exist, the society that quietly allows it all to continue. And then the film opens wider because suddenly this stops being a story about a fallen woman, a woman who was taken in her youth. Now it becomes a story about a society, a system, a machine sustained by demand, silence, money, hypocrisy, and worst of all, normalization. And honestly, I think that's the moment the movie stopped being merely a romance story for me and became something much more unsettling. Because the Sikh's comments forces both the character and the audience to confront something uncomfortable. You see, it's easy to judge the visible victim inside a corrupt system. It's much harder to confront the invisible structures and appetites that sustain the system itself. And then the movie takes another turn. By this point, the man realizes that he's actually in love with her. So he goes to the brothel where she lives. And the way the film stages this scene is what really got under my skin. It's this interior courtyard filled with young women standing around balconies and railings, almost like the entire ecosystem has settled into routine. There's an older madam running the place. The men behind it all are mostly invisible. And when he shows up asking for her, the people around him almost mock him. Oh, another man who fell in love with one of the girls, like they've seen this story 100 times before. And when he finally sees her, he apologizes for judging her. He asks her to come live with him. At first, she refuses, then eventually she goes with him. But even after that, the system never releases her. There's another scene where she's sent to a party for a group of young men. And when she returns afterwards, she can barely walk. She's physically broken down, exhausted, clearly brutalized by what just happened to her. But what disturbed me wasn't simply the violence of it, it was the normalcy of it. This wasn't happening in secret tunnels underneath the earth. This was happening in apartments, neighborhoods, communities. People knew. And somehow life just continued around it. And I think that's the moment the film truly got to me. The funny thing is, when I walked out of the theater, that isn't what I was talking about. I wasn't talking about trafficking. I wasn't talking about exploitation. I wasn't talking about darkness. I was talking about the filmmaking. I was talking about the compositing, how some of the interiors felt disconnected from the exteriors, how the Foley work was strangely excellent while other parts of the production felt rough around the edges, how punches seemed to land a foot short, how certain scenes felt polished and others didn't. I remember searching for words to describe the film as a whole: juvenile, sophomoric, junior varsity, not as an insult, just trying to describe what felt uneven about the production. And none of these observations were wrong. But looking back, I think they were hiding something. Because the more I talked about the filmmaking, the less I was talking about what the movie was actually doing to me. In fact, I spent hours talking about everything except the thing that was bothering me. Maybe that's human nature. Maybe I was keeping the film at arm's length because the subject matter was uncomfortable. So my mind latched onto the things that were easier to discuss: the compositing, the editing, the Foley, the rough edges. And while I was doing that, the actual message of the film was quietly seeking deeper and deeper. Then I went to sleep. And when I woke up the next morning, something strange had happened. The compositing didn't matter anymore. The punches didn't matter anymore. The editing didn't matter anymore. But the discomfort remained. And that's what finally made me stop and think. Because I've seen bad movies before. I've walked out of bad movies before, like The Bride. I've walked out of films that simply weren't working for me, like Protector. And I've forgotten countless movies that were rough around the edges. In fact, when I walked out of the theater that night, my first instinct was that this wasn't a particularly polished film. If that was all the movie had been, I probably would have forgotten it by the next morning. But I didn't. The next day, I was still thinking about it, and that bothered me. Because if the movie was really as weak as I thought it was, why was it still sitting there? Why was it still turning over in my mind? Why was I still talking about it? And that's when I realized something. Maybe I wasn't thinking about the movie anymore. Maybe I was thinking about what the movie had uncovered. Because underneath all my criticism of the filmmaking, something else had been happening. The story had gotten inside me. So while I was busy talking about compositing, Foley work, fight choreography, and rough edges, the actual message of the film was quietly seeking deeper and deeper. So when I woke up the next morning, filmmaking didn't matter anymore. And that's when I started thinking about where I live. Houston, Texas has one of the largest human trafficking problems in the United States. And living here, you realize quickly that trafficking does not look like what movies taught us to think it looks like. It hides in plain sight. Hotels, apartments, truck stops, massage parlors, neighborhoods, ordinary life continuing while something darker operates underneath it. Then I started thinking about Boston. Years ago, while working for the federal government, I attended a seminar at the Boston Public Library about modern slavery and human trafficking. I remember sitting there listening to people explain how these systems sustain themselves financially, psychologically, socially, how difficult they are to dismantle once they become normalized inside economies and communities. Different city, different setting, same darkness. And then my mind drifted even further back. Korea, 1986. I was stationed there in the military, and one occasion I was traveling with the softball team. One night we were out at a club, and I remember sitting there talking to a young woman. I think she was from the Philippines or Thailand. And she started telling me her story, how recruiters brought girls over with the promise of making money dancing, how their passports were taken, how they became trapped economically, how they danced in clubs trying to survive long enough to somehow make enough money to get back home. And what hit me years later is how easily the story in Luv Di Saun could have been my story. Not as some villain, not as some monster, just as a young man sitting in a club, talking to someone, forming a connection, not fully understanding the machinery operating around both of us. And then another memory came back. When I was stationed in Kunsan Air Base, I worked as a medic in the STD clinic. There was a nearby village soldiers called A-Town. The hostesses there wore numbers on their shirts or blouses. The soldiers were told, if you go with one of the girls, remember her number. And when the soldiers came into the clinic with infections, we would ask, what was her number? They'd give us the number. We'd go to a shelf that had a lot of books. The books matched numbers to girls. Then we would notify Korean nationals or the Korean clinics off base. And then the Korean nationals would go find the woman associated with that number and treat her for an STD. Think about that. The entire system had become procedural, cataloged, tracked, managed. That was not darkness hiding from civilization. That was civilization building administrative systems around darkness. And then my mind went even further back. Los Angeles, high school basketball. I remember sitting on the team bus after a game at Hollywood High School. We were parked across from a motel, waiting to leave. And I remember watching men walk in and out of rooms while women stood in doorways, outside, peddling wares. As a teenager, you don't fully process what you're looking at. Years later, you do. And then finally, my mind went to the Pacific Northwest. Years ago, when I became the city prosecutor in SeaTac, Washington, part of my orientation involved officers driving me through the community. And one of the places they pointed out was Gary Ridgway's house, the Green River Killer, one of the most prolific serial killers in American history. Think about that for a second. A normal neighborhood, a house, a normal street, and yet one of the darkest men in modern American history lived there. Darkness living quietly inside ordinary life. And maybe that's why stories like this stay with us, because human beings create astonishing beauty. We create music, architecture, poetry, technology, cinema. We've landed men on the moon. We've sent machines beyond our solar system. And yet somehow, alongside all this advancement, human darkness continues evolving too. That contradiction fascinates me because we often talk about civilization as if technological progress automatically means moral progress. But history doesn't really support that. The tools evolve, the systems evolve, the world modernizes, but exploitation, corruption, violence, greed, domination, and cruelty never fully disappear. And maybe that's one of the reasons storytelling exists in the first place. We say movies are escapism, but escapism from what? Anxiety? Fear? Loneliness? Death? The awareness of darkness itself? Because if you look at many of the films considered among the greatest ever made, they constantly return to corruption and moral collapse. The Godfather 1 and 2, The Deer Hunter, The Silence of the Lambs, Scarface. Again and again, audiences are drawn towards stories about crime, violence, betrayal, power, and human weakness. Why? I don't fully know. But maybe cinema allows us to move close to darkness without fully stepping into it ourselves. Maybe stories give us a controlled place to confront things we would otherwise avoid looking at directly. And what's interesting about Luv Di Saun is that it is not a perfectly polished film. There are rough edges to it, unevenness, moments where you can feel the seams, but strangely enough, I think that roughness helped the experience. Because the subject matter is already so uncomfortable that if it had been presented with absolute cinematic perfection, I almost think it would have changed the emotional effect entirely. The film felt raw, uneasy, human, and maybe that's why it stayed with me. Not because it was technically perfect, not because it had the biggest budget, but because underneath everything, it was wrestling with something real. Not politics, not internet outrage, not slogans, just humanity. And maybe that's the real question the film leaves behind. Where is the monster? In the world? In the systems we build? In us? Or somewhere even closer? In myself?